a romance in Episode 8. John Boyega says, we didn't establish a romance in 7. We never played it that way. Daisy and I were friends. And then he's asked, so there's no romance. He says, yes, Finn and Rey, they're just friends. Finn is a stormtrooper, so he doesn't really know what's going on. So the romance thing is something that's going to be interesting in the next installment. It's not going to go the way you think it's going to go. He was asked, how is it working with Rian Johnson after working with J.J. Abrams? It's been very easy, said Boyega. Rian Johnson is great. It's a different take, darker, bigger. Some will say, how do you get bigger than The Force Awakens? But it's crazy. John Boyega is reprising his role as Finn. He was asked about one of his new co-stars, Kelly Marie Tran, who Boyega proceeded to then rave about. She's great. She's freaking great. I love her. I freaking love her. She's fantastic. Seriously, she's changed a lot in terms of perspective on just chemistry and industry. She's a really cool girl. She's fully in the movie. She's a great character. I just can't wait for you guys to be introduced to her. Now, there was some leaked photos taken from the production in Dubrovnik. And in those photos, there were images of John Boyega riding this, I think they called it a space horse. I think that's what they called it. The space horse down the street with Kelly Marie Tran in Dubrovnik. And so the speculation is now that that's where the romance is going to lie, is that John Boyega's character Finn is going to have some type of romance with this actress Kelly Marie Tran, who hasn't really done much of anything, I think, apart from a little bit of TV and some comedy. Which could create a very interesting dynamic, because I brought up the possibility that, perhaps there's a bit of a jealousy thing going on when Rey comes back from training and, is reunited with Finn in the film. When asked about the difference between Rian Johnson and J.J. Abrams, John Boyega said Rian is his own man. You can't compare the two. They're of the same ilk creatively, both talented, but two different guys. I really dig Rian. To step in like that. I hope we get to work together on something in the future, because he has a great artistic eye. He's not Hollywood at all. This is a big Hollywood blockbuster film. You know what I'm saying with him behind the energy. You don't feel like you're on a Hollywood set. You feel like you're in the midst of friends and people who want to work on something creatively great. And if you haven't seen Looper, go watch Looper. Looper's a fantastic film, and really, to me, has almost a Star Wars A New Hope vibe to it. I can see his aesthetic working very well, and the way that he sets up his shots and the way that he films his movies. It's not like a Michael Bay or even a J.J. Abrams. It really has a very accessible aesthetic that I think is going to lend itself fantastic to The Force Awakens. Now, Oscar Isaac was also interviewed. He was doing interview junkets for his new film, X-Men Apocalypse, and he was asked about, of course, Star Wars Episode 8, and he had this to say. When asked about his character living to see another day in 7, Poe Dameron was initially going to die in the film, but he convinced J.J. Abrams otherwise. He says, well, I'm around, first of all, which is nice. The new additions to the cast, like Laura Dern, Benicio del Toro, they're incredible actors, and Rian Johnson, his sensibility is one of smaller films, the Golden Globe winner explained. So within all the bigness and the epic scope of the film, it does feel like we're getting to find some of that nuance and intimacy. He revealed that his character is going to get a lot more action in Episode 8, which is set to push the characters to their limits. He says Poe, he gets to be more a part of the story. All of the characters in the film, they get tested intensely. It's a lot of conflict in it, which is great. So, again, we're hearing very consistent things about Episode 8. That it's bigger, but it's also darker. And I think that's always the expectation, right? I mean, I think the movies, while I doubt that Episode 8 is going to be as much of an echo, reflection, mirror the way that Episode 7 was to The Force Awakens, I do think it's going to play that middle part role of being darker. And it's where the heroes face a major setback. And you're going to have conflict Without conflict, these characters don't grow. Without conflict, these characters don't get anywhere. You need to have a sense of dread. You need to have urgency. You need to have questions. And I think that's what Rian Johnson is absolutely going to deliver. And I've said this all along. I think the setup to Colin Trevorrow, who did Jurassic World in Episode 9, bringing this whole thing for a circle is a brilliant move. I think he's going to close this out in a very blockbuster-esque, grandiose fashion after, going backwards to go forwards in 7. Having the middle act is where, by Lawrence Kasdan's own words, when it comes to The Empire Strikes Back, all hell breaks loose for the characters. And then by the end of it, is where the good guys end up, triumphing, and there's some resolution involved. I really think they're setting it up nicely. I will say, just as a quick side note, in reference to Episode 7 mirroring Episode 4, I did read a very interesting article the other day, which kind of made me do a little pat on my back, because I've mentioned this before, that if you want to see some parallels, there's actually almost just as many parallels with The Phantom Menace and The Force Awakens as there is with A New Hope and The Force Awakens. And as a matter of fact, I read this article that pointed to the fact, and I don't have time to get into it in this podcast, maybe we'll do it with Episode 51, but this article that I read actually pointed to how The Force Awakens had a lot more in common with The Phantom Menace than it did with A New Hope, and that made me chuckle a little bit, because I still enjoy The Phantom Menace. Not as good as the original trilogy, but still a very enjoyable film, and as I've always said, I really enjoy the prequels. As a matter of fact, I wish it wasn't a Monday night, because I want to watch Attack of the Clones tonight, simply because it's the 13-year anniversary. So, all right, I have just enough time to run through this list to close out the podcast this week. What I learned from Star Wars. And this is taken from the perspective of I was a little kid, 5 years old. So there were certain things that I wasn't aware of in terms of the world and what can happen. Not just people related, but also sort of physics related, which leads me to the very first one. And that is, there is no up or down in space. As a kid, watching A New Hope, when they break free of the Death Star and they send those smattering of TIE fighters just to be used as pawns, which as a kid kind of confused me too, until we found out that it was a setup, but I never understood, even as a kid, why the characters didn't realize this, because I kept thinking to myself, if these guys were so important, they certainly had way more TIE fighters to send after the Millennium Falcon than 4 or 5 that they sent after. Maybe it wasn't even that many? Or was there 3? I should know this, and I don't. But when they go to the gunner positions in the Millennium Falcon, and Han goes up and Luke goes down, I remember being so confused as a child, because I was thinking to myself, well, wait a second, how does that work? He climbed up and now is sitting and not falling, and now Luke climbed down and he's sitting and not falling forward. And I remember, I don't know if I talked to my dad about it or I talked to somebody about it, but that's when I learned about how there's no up or down in space. Now, it still doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the Millennium Falcon obviously had gravity, so it still should have had an effect in where they went to in those gunner positions. But be that as it may, that's where I first learned about, hey, there's no up or down in space. I also learned that sometimes the bad guys can be good guys. This goes back to Han shot first. As a kid, first off, Han shot first. Let's not even dispute that. As a matter of fact, the actor who played Greedo came out last week and said in the original script it says Han shoots the alien. Luke has changed that. He's a liar if he says anything different. Han shot first. Because I remember as a kid watching that scene, and it had a huge impact on me. I was like, whoa, this dude killed this guy, and he shot first. And I remember that really stuck with me. And it stuck with me the whole rest of the film until he returns at the end to bail out Luke and send Darth Vader spinning out into space. I also learned, and this was interesting to me because while it was happening on a natural level at that age, I was watching it take place on TV and being told the story. But I learned that fathers are super important. Because at that age of 5 and 6 years old, of growing up with A New Hope and really feeling for Luke, and certainly that had a huge impact when I saw The Empire Strikes Back. But I remember thinking to myself that, wow, I could really relate to Luke, and fathers are way important. And this was at a time at 5 and 6 years old where I'm beginning to gravitate towards my father and realizing how important he is in my life, and I could really relate to that. I also learned about the subtlety of sarcasm. When, after they escape from the Death Star, and Han is screwing with Luke about Leia in the Falcon, and, what do you think of her, Han? I'm trying not to, kid. Good. And Han notices that, Luke's got a thing for Leia. Still, she's got a lot of spirit. I don't know. You think a princess and a guy like me? No. And then you see that smirk on Han Solo's face. That was like one of the first moments I remember as a kid going, that's really sarcastic. Or I didn't even know, at the time I probably didn't know what the word was, but I just learned the subtlety of sarcasm. I learned that females can be strong leaders. Princess Leia, get this walking carpet out of my way. That was something that I wasn't used to seeing, something that I was certainly exposed to as a little kid. Self-sacrifice, being honorable. Obi-Wan seeing that there was no way that they were going to be able to escape the Death Star if he didn't go and sacrifice himself. Now, it's a bit of a cheat because, he knew he was coming back as a Force ghost. But be that as it may, I learned that self-sacrifice was honorable. And then the last 3 that I have on my list, because really by the time I got around to Return of the Jedi, I had grown up a little bit, so there wasn't really anything that I really learned. But from The Empire Strikes Back, I learned that cutting open an animal and shoving a body into it can keep it warm. That moment when they cut open the Tauntaun and Han put Luke into his belly, that always stuck with me. I'm like, why in the world did he do that? And then it was like, okay. That was when I learned that warmth trumped smelly guts of Tauntauns. The complexities of relationships in strenuous situations. More specifically, Han and Leia, the kiss they have on the Millennium Falcon, learning at that moment when they're interrupted by C-3PO that sometimes the moment goes away. Because I remember as a kid watching that scene, they have that moment, and I was a hopeless romantic even as a young child, but they had that moment, C-3PO shows up, and then I felt so bad for Han because Leia had walked away. I learned that sometimes the moment passes, because as I got older, I realized that for myself. And I remember one of the first times where I, in a relationship, and the moment had passed, I immediately recalled that moment. And I went, that was my Princess Leia and Millennium Falcon Han Solo C-3PO moment. And then the last thing I learned, and again, going back to The Empire Strikes Back, not having all the answers is sometimes better. I remember at the end of The Empire Strikes Back as a kid going, surely that's not it. There has to be more. Well, we can't end it with Han being gone. How is that possible? How can that happen? And then slowly coming to the realization that was cool. That, wow, anticipation is good, even if it is for a number of years, right? Of course, now that I'm older, I do podcasts where I spend almost every single one speculating on who Rey's parents are. So how much have I grown up? Thanks for hanging out for episode 50 of the podcast. Sorry it's a few days late, but I appreciate you checking it out as always. If you want to drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. Talkshownerd@gmail.com. And let me say this, because I'm just about out of time. I do have some very special things planned for the near future. So I hope you continue supporting the podcast, subscribe on iTunes, drop me an email, follow me on Twitter @Jon Justice. And until next week and episode 51, may the Force be with you always.
My nerd